Okay, everybody, good afternoon. Thank you again for coming to our Qahwa and Kalam lunch hour series. Today we are especially happy to have with us Terrence Walz. I know that many of you already know him and are familiar with his work. Terry has worked extensively on the history of slavery in Egypt and Sudan, and today he's presenting us with something quite rare. These are letters from a family archive in Egypt that he has exclusive access to, and some of these are letters written by slaves, so we are very excited to hear more about that. And hopefully we can have like 20-30 minutes of your talk and then have more time for discussion. Please also help yourselves, there are refreshments at the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I mean, it's a pleasure to go over this material. I've been working on it for about 3 years, and I'm never getting tired of it, which is probably a sign of my age, but on the other hand, I find it so interesting to work with. So what the talk is going to be today is kind of a couple of stories. One of them has to do with the slave named Bilal Khayr, and where he came from and how he came to work with the family and what he was doing. And the second has to do with the archive itself, which is located with a family in Upper Egypt, and how I came to discover it. And so this is the lecture with two stories, Bilal and the family archive. It's well known that in the 19th century, slaves were often purchased by busy merchants to work with them, and in their shops as assistants and errand boys. And usually when they bought them, they would try to get young slaves that could be trained. And this was something that I discovered when I was working on my first book, which is called Trade Between Egypt and Bilad As-Sudan, 1700-1820, where I spent a lot of time working in the archives of the Mahkama Shara'iyya in Cairo. And it was confirmed with the second book that I co-edited with Kenneth Cuno, called Race and Slavery in the Middle East, focusing on case histories of trans-Saharan Africans in a variety of, principally in Egypt, but in a variety of countries in the Middle East. That was published by AUC Press, and I have to give it a plug. So, the young slaves are usually purchased between 6 and 8 years old, according to the statistics that I worked on in the census of Egypt in 1848. And they usually worked for about 15 years, after which they were usually emancipated and often married to somebody and given a house to live in, although many of them elected to stay in the house that they had been brought up in. That's particularly true with the women. With the men, there was a tendency to set up separate establishments. Some of the slaves were so entrusted with trust by their masters that they were often married into the master's own family. There was a case of that I came across several times of merchants who worked in the great bazaar in Cairo that dealt with Sudanese goods and is known as the Wakalat al-Galala, and I'll come back to that. One such case is Bilal. He worked for a family of merchants in the Upper Egyptian city of Alsaud, and the family was known, or the firm was known as the Beit al-Gahari, or the Ikhwan Gahari. And their main offices were in Alsaud, but they also had branch offices in Qina and in Cairo. The trade of the family firm was in Sudanese goods that were brought by caravan from Darfur and kordofan, and in agricultural products, especially grains and legumes, that is, wheat, barley, beans, lentils, that were grown in abundance in Upper Egypt, particularly the province of Qahwa and Isna, but also Girga, Sohag, and Assiout, and they had agents in all of those towns. Bilal was given the second name of his owner, Khayr. His owner was Khayr Dosugari, or his principal owner was Khayr Dosugari, and this was common for slaves to be given a second name of the owner. But he was also allowed to use the patronymic, which was El-Ghari, unusual. So he was really known, and he signed some of his letters, or had them signed, Bilal Khayr El-Ghari. But I'd like to give you a little backup about the slave trade in Egypt, because not everyone understands that it was a phenomenon here in Egypt, and how Bilal was brought to Assiout and purchased by the family. In the 19th century, Egypt imported larger and larger number of slaves from the south of the Sudan, from the areas that are known as Southern Sudan, South Darfur, and all the way as far away as Chad and the Central African Republic. Raiding parties were organized by African governments that raided the heathen areas, the so-called heathen areas to the south and to the west that were not Islamicized, in order to send them north where they could be exchanged for luxury goods. Then in the 19th century, with the invasion of the Sudan, the Egyptian regime in the Sudan started raiding villages in order to gather a new army that Muhammad Ali wanted to create in the beginning exclusively of black troops. And this was called the Nizam al-Jadid. This photo, which I find so interesting, appears on the internet, but I've never been able to find the source of it. So if anybody knows what it is, please let me know. It's going automatically. Yeah. And the next one. Yeah. These are the Egyptian troops that participated in the war in Mexico, 1863. Most of whom were black troops, and they came back and were decorated by the French army, by the French emperor. They were, in fact, a gesture of solidarity with the French emperor by Khedive Ismail, that the slaves were sent over. They were part of the Egyptian army. Black soldiers were sent over to work to fight for Maximilian in Mexico during that period. And slaves were also brought north by independent traders, many of whom operated out of Khartoum, and would bring their goods to Cairo, sometimes individually, sometimes in larger numbers. This photograph shows a boat full of slaves being shipped north to Cairo. And this rare photograph from the 1850s is a man who has two girls for sale. Thousands of men and women were forcibly migrated north in the 19th century. Most of the men consigned to military life, and the women consigned to work as drudges in domestic service, or sometimes in the factories that Muhammad Ali set up in Cairo in the 1820s and 30s. It is believed that hundreds of thousands of the trans-Saharan Africans were migrated north in this fashion. The slave trade came to Egypt via three caravan routes. one of them from Khartoum north to Talal, which is near Aswan, another one from Darfur feeding via the Dar al-Arba'in, a caravan route, to near the city of Assiout, and the third one coming in from the Western Desert was also called the Maghrebi Hajj caravan, but it also included many slaves from Central Africa that docked at villages near the pyramids, one of them being Kirdassa. They were finally brought into Cairo, where they were sold at the slave market in Cairo known as Wakalat al-Galaba. This was a print done about 1830. And that was done a little bit later. The Wakalat al-Galaba dates from the time of Sultan Zbori, although it was under a different use at the time, and it still exists. In fact, the front doorway of the Wakalat al-Galaba was refurbished by the Ministry of Antiquities recently. Ali Mubarak says that the number of slaves in your household was often an indicator in those days of wealth and standing. Many of the newly rich Turkish households had 10 or more. The governor of Assiout, who was a Turk in the 1840s and 50s, had his household enumerated in the 1848 census. He had 60 people living there, including 8 Mamluks, 4 eunuchs, a dozen white females, and 24 black slaves, black female slaves. The Ministry of War in Cairo had about 100 different slaves working in his household, and the ruling family of Muhammad Ali and his all of his cousins and daughters and nieces and sons and so forth had hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves working in the palaces. Ibrahim Pasha's household alone had 233 female slaves. But a look at the 1848 census shows that many ordinary households also had slaves, maybe 1 or 2. And these were often households that were associated with bureaucrats, the merchant class, and the ulama class, that is the higher religious scholars, class of higher religious scholars. And the trade continued on in Egypt for the first decades, 7 decades of the 19th century, until finally slavery was abolished in 1877. And many thousands were freed. They were given these emancipation documents, freedom papers, which usually describes what their name is, who they were freed by, what their nationality was. And they had to keep those in order not to be enslaved again. But to return to the subject of my talk, Bilal Khayr, we know nothing about his background, unfortunately. Since Assiout received a lot of slaves from Darfur, and since the Al-Ghali family, for whom we worked, had close relations with the long-distance merchants from Darfur called Galaba, it seems logical to believe that he was brought from that kingdom to Egypt. And so it's remembered by members of the family that he was Darfur. He was probably a teenager when he arrived. The preferred age of slaves to be purchased was someone who was called a Sudasi. That is, he was 6 spans high, which means that he was probably between the ages of 14 and 16. He may have been trained in the Al-Ghali house, or he may have been purchased by somebody else and then passed on to them, where he learned Arabic and converted to Islam. And he may have started his work in the Al-Ghari family doing what many of their other slaves did, which was to run errands, load and offload cargoes from Cairo and the cities in Upper Egypt, accompanied shipments of cash, which were called surah, from place to place. Most likely the family realized he was highly intelligent and especially good with numbers and people. And so he was assigned to work with their branch in Kenneth, and eventually became the right-hand man of the manager of that branch, which was one of the Al-Ghari brothers named Theodos Al-Ghari, thus the name. I believe he was literate on the basis of some 5 letters and several accounts that he drew up that have survived in the Al-Ghari papers. These were papers that belonged to the Al-Ghari family of Alsaud. A little bit about the family and how I became interested in them, and how I came to work with the family papers. The Beit Al-Ghari were 3 generations of merchants who flourished for a very short period of time, 1830 to about 1865. The patriarch of the firm was a man named Dos Latas, and nothing is known about his grandfather, nor is his work known. He may have been a merchant, but it's difficult to know from the sources. But he started the business. He had 3 sons by his first wife, and they were all active in the firm as it developed. Khayr, whom I've mentioned, worked out at Kenneth, which was the center of grain production and a lively market due to the caravan route in Kenneth that went to the Hejaz. And thousands of pilgrims, particularly from Western Africa, filed through the town. The center of operations was Alsaud, which was headed by the eldest of the sons, Shenouda, and Cairo, which was headed by the younger son named Abdulaziz. And he worked in a khan called, or a caravanserai called Khan Abu Ta'ayya. Couldn't find a picture of it, but this is where it's located in Cairo. The 3 brothers had 13 children between them, of whom 2 were male and 11 were female. And so the men that the daughters married all came more or less to work for the firm, and they married into some well-known families, as it turns out, including the Ubaid family of Kenneth, which later became known because of William Makram Ubaid, who was a nationalist figure in the 20th century. As I said, the Beit al-Ghari specialized in exporting agricultural goods to the north, to Cairo, in exchange for textiles. And textiles were an extremely important item, because everybody wanted them in Upper Egypt. They could not, in fact, keep enough bolts of this calico cloth called kham in the shop. I mean, it was so popular. But at that time, agricultural produce was under strict government regulation. In fact, it was under a monopoly, and then under strict supervision. So in order for merchants to find a place, they had to cooperate with the government, with the officials in their provincial governments. Permissions to ship grains north had to be obtained from the government. Contracts for the sale of grains could also be obtained. The top officials, the governors and the nazirs, were often wanted goods of specific quality, and they relied on the merchants to supply them, often on credit. These details help to explain passages in Bilal's letters to his masters. In one of them, he makes a request from the governor, the Nazir of Kenneth, and he says, "Please comply with his wish, as he is good to us." They also dealt in Sudanese goods, which in those days meant slaves, ivory, ostrich feathers, and gum. But the largest quantity of goods was in grain. But it was because of the Sudanese goods that I came in touch with the Gohari family in 1971, and I met them again in 1976. While talking to the head of the family, Dr. Almia El-Gohari, and after expressing great interest in the letters, a few letters that he kept in his home, which he showed me, he said, "You must go visit the old house in the old part of Terrell, in the Suit." And so I went with his younger son to this area called Kom Abbas. We entered the house through a cul-de-sac and a small doorway. This was a photograph I took in 1976. The house, by the way, is now destroyed, so it no longer exists. And we went inside, and there were a series of rooms. In fact, it was a large complex of 3 houses that had been put together into a single house where various members of the family lived. It had a very confusing outlay. Some of the rooms were very ornate, and eventually we worked into a large courtyard which is dominated by an impressive column and a stairway leading up to the second floor. I showed this slide to, I may have showed this slide to Ola Save, and said it had these nice little crosses like crenellations at the top, and asked her if there was anything on Christian art, secular architecture, and still trying to track that down. But it's one of the few aspects that reveals their own Christian link. This was a very fancy ceiling that was put in one of the upstairs rooms. The house was inhabited by a lady called Colianta, who was the older sister of Dr. O'Neill. And she lived there with her chickens and her goats and a water buffalo, which were in some of the older rooms. She said, "Please go upstairs. I haven't been up in 10 years. And so we did. We went upstairs, and in one of the rooms upstairs, I found these. Quite amazing Sudanese swords and shields, including what's called a rahat, which is a kind of leather grass skirt that women in Nubia and the Sudan used to wear. These were either presents to the family, or they had been kept by the family for the visiting merchants from Darfur, because they were under law required to store their arms in households. They couldn't go around town with arms. They had to store them somewhere while they were in a suit. Back downstairs, I went to another room that was Italianate in decoration, and in the middle of the room found a large basket. And the basket were stuffed letters and account books, and some other papers and lots of receipts. And this was how I rediscovered the Al-Ghari papers, which the family it appears, had lost track of. I made a short inventory of the papers, sorted them out in a crude fashion, photocopied a couple of them, including a court case from the Mahkamat of Darfur regarding a loan that had been made to one of the Ghari brothers and not repaid for 12 years, but the man finally repaid the debt and wanted the family to know that the debt had been paid off. This was in 1976, and I wasn't able to get back to look at the archives because I took a job and decided to do something different. But after I published the book on race and slavery in the Middle East, I was asked if I would be interested in going back and looking at the Ghari papers, and I said I would, but I don't know if they still exist. So I did write the head of the family then, the son of Dr. Armia, Megdi al-Ghari, and he said eventually, yes, they are. They are exactly as you left them, except we put them in a box. And that is the box that the Al-Ghari papers are located in. They have traveled up to Cairo umpteen times and back down to Assued. But whenever I come, Megdi al-Ghari is a wonderful, wonderful friend and mentor. Gladly brings them up. It's a small archive by our standards, compared, say, to the archives of the merchants of Prato. If any of you know medieval history, these were the great merchants of Italy who kept an extensive archive of documentation on their goods. This is nothing like that, but you get a flavor of it. And they consist of, just for your information, 370 letters containing commercial correspondence, 56 dated and undated miscellaneous receipts, 7 telegraph messages, mostly from the early 1860s, 3 postal statements of the number of letters that they sent and when during the 1850s, 4 account books, 94 documents relating to family affairs, including inheritance, last wills and testament, and donations of candles to various churches in the area. 36 relating to property deeds that they purchased over the years, and 14 documents relating to the position of the last of the Al-Gharis, who became French consular agent in Assued and also agent of the Suez Canal Company in the 1850s and 60s. Together, the archive shines a bright light onto the operations of the merchants working in Upper Egypt in the 19th century. This was a time when there was great interference in trade, and it's fascinating to see how they worked around it. It also sheds light on Christian life in provincial Upper Egypt, which is a subject very few people have looked into. And it also tells a great deal about the history of Assued, and provincial history is another area that needs to be worked on, if any of you are so inclined. Archives for a very short period of time, only 4 years. He may have been literate, but in fact we do not know, because most of the letters are written by a scribe, perhaps all of them. And it's difficult to know whether he dictated them or was able to write it. I'm going to show you now a sample of the letter, one of the letters, in fact the first one, that was written in 1850. This is a short letter, it's only a page and a half. And in it, he's letting them know, that is his master, that there are various receipts from the government that are coming to them that need to be redeemed, that is cashed. They had a very complicated system in Upper Egypt because there was no banking system in this time. This was 1850s. And so people and merchants had to got around this by using what are called hawalat. In fact, they're still being used today in parts of difficult parts of Africa which don't have operating banking systems. So this letter concerns a lot of hawala. And so he's letting them know who's coming with what and how much they are. What's interesting about them is that he punctuates his letters by using this phrase, I them, or the word I them, which is his way of expressing a bullet point. That is, he's changing the subject. And this is a 3 I-them letter. There are 3 bullet points. He's got 3 important matters for him that he wants to get across in this letter. He was a very diligent correspondent. This letter is dated the 1st of Hijjah, the 2nd of Hijjah. You find his signature here. That's actually Gamal. That's actually Gamal al-Awwal, not Hijjah. When the Gim goes up, I think it means it's the first Gamad, which is a Muslim month. And he's always very deferent to whomever he's addressing in the letters, such as kissing your hand, and you know, this is your respectful slave, Bilal Khayr, sort of taba hajudukum. And he not only uses this with Khayr, but he uses it with every member of the family. Of course, he was the slave of the entire family. I mean, he was one of the pieces of property that the family owned. So he belonged to the entire family. Most of his letters also indicated that he was keeping track of store inventories, shipments to and from Kenneth and other villages, notables who had called, and that when there was a sort of shortage of government cash in the governmental coffers, he was often asked to track down debtors and try to get the money out of them, and he would go distances to other villages, in fact, to try to get something of a payment out of some of these debtors. Eventually, he became the deputy of Khayr, and this we know from a document that has survived in draft, where he became, in fact, the wakil of Khayr, a quite extraordinary position of trust for a slave. There are no letters after 1854, and in 1857, we know that the household was already disbanded. In an undated document, which is also quite amazing, but I'm not going to go through it as I'd hoped to, they made all of the goods that he owned, including his wardrobe, and all the bits and pieces of his household, were shipped back to Assyut and enumerated, so that we know exactly what he probably dressed in, which is amazing. I mean, we don't have a photograph of him, but we know that he was quite a dandy. He had a lot of clothes, and this may have been because he was a slave, he was black, and he came into contact with top provincial officers all the time and needed to impress him. The document also includes the clothing of his wife. She was Kalthum el-Gharia, as she was called, Kalthum the slave woman, And her wardrobe is also described. And she didn't dress shabbily either, and she also had some jewelry that Bilal had made for her. And in another letter we discovered it had been done by a certain jeweler in Kenneth, whose name is given. We can only catch a very short glimpse of Bilal in these letters of what he was really like. But we come away from them with this idea that he was a highly trustworthy person, a very organized person, and probably given a great position within the family. This may have been because he was intelligent, but it may also have been because his immediate master, Khayr, had no sons of his own. He had daughters, and so he may have been the son substitute that he wanted. I've worked on slavery for a number of years, but I've never come across letters written by slaves. So this is the first time I've ever seen anything like it. I know they exist in other places, particularly in the West, but in this part of Africa, it's very unusual. And so it just draws attention to the richness of this family archive. And indeed, we need to do all we can to find them, locate them, and work on them. Thank you very much. Sorry,
Fascinating. Are you going to publish them, do you think, or?
The letters?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
They're too unusual.
Yes, they're amazing. Questions? We have a few minutes for questions. I'll start with another one. You mentioned something about Bilal having been converted, were you speaking in general about slaves? Because I noticed this is a Coptic family and he was converted to Islam, or do we not know exactly?
Well, he took the name Bilal, and so that's obviously a Muslim name, so it was usual for slaves to become Muslim because it was the dominant religion, and I think it's kind of enhanced their position within the community that they became Muslim. Rarely do you find cases of slaves. Some women did, and they were taken on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, as a matter of fact, as a reward for their faithful service, to the family. But it's something unusual for men in particular.
Good afternoon. I wanted to know, I have two questions. How common was it for an enslaved Muslim to work for a Christian family in Upper Egypt or anywhere in Egypt?
Well, that's an interesting question because, in theory, if you didn't like working for your Christian family, you could complain to the local judge that you found it objectionable to work for him. And there are cases of that, but sometimes women didn't like working for a Christian owner. They exist in the court case, but it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. And many Christians did own slaves. I mean, it was, in fact, unusual elsewhere, probably in the Muslim world, but in Egypt it was pretty common. And not only that, foreigners were allowed to buy slaves. Christian foreigners who settled in Cairo in the 19th century bought slaves in the Wakalat Galaba. And nobody ever stopped them from doing it.
Other questions? It's okay.
I don't know if your research, maybe not specifically regarding Bilal, but during the course of your research, have you been able to sort of uncover what happened to some of these enslaved individuals after emancipation?
Some of them are, there's a lot of work to be done on that subject, as a matter of fact. some of the slaves that were emancipated in Cairo in the 1880s, or the 1870s and 1880s, when the Emancipation Act went through, the police department in Cairo would turn them over to an English lady who ran a house called the Cairo Home for Freed Slave Women, which existed, and they were trained at that point. That is, the African slaves who were there were trained in things like domestic arts, you know, and needlework, and sort of cleaning household, and you know, becoming good drudges. And sometimes they were then shipped to other homes where they, you know, could work for a living. I mean, it's kind of a sad thing to have happened, but that's in fact what happened to some of them. They started working for other homes. Many of them, and there's some really interesting research that could be done on the basis of documents in the National Archives that shows what happened with a lot of slaves who petitioned to have change of masters after they were emancipated. They no longer wanted to work for certain masters, and they applied to work elsewhere. And the government acceded to them. They allowed them to do that. If they had the money, you know, they might have wanted to return to the Sudan if they knew where their home was. Most likely they didn't, because many of them were in fact brutally taken away. French in Zamalek called Saint Joseph. They kept track of what happened to some of the slaves that converted to Catholicism, and they were given names, and you can track through their records what happened to them. Some of them in the early days were purchased from slave markets and sent abroad for learning and teaching, where they might become spreaders of Christianity and return to the Sudan. And we know that is the case with several of them. I've written about one of them named Bahita Kouachi, that you can find that story on the internet. She was from Darfur, got purchased in the market in Cairo, was sent to Italy, where she was trained in Verona, sent back to Cairo, and then sent to the mission in the Sudan, where she worked until she was unfortunately captured by the Mahdists in 1884 and was thrown into prison. And she had quite a life, believe me.
Final question?
Final question? Am I the last one? Does anybody else have a question? No? Okay, well, then I'll ask my question. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I work on slavery, and I find it quite a difficult subject to talk about with my students, because generally the awareness of slave history in Egypt is quite low, which I think is an interesting challenge. I mean, so we obviously have to change secondary school curriculums to include the story of slavery. But the story of slavery in Egypt is so much more complicated than the system of agricultural or chattel slavery in somewhere like the United States or the Western Hemisphere. Because you have people like this. I mean, obviously we have agricultural slavery in the Arab Middle East as well, but we also have these kinds of figures and other figures like Bilal throughout history in terms of, I don't know exactly how I think about it, because there's obviously a spectrum of freedom. I mean, he's someone else's personal property, but he's engaging in a whole different set of activities than what we might think of a slave as doing. And then we have other kinds of slaves in terms of artisans and performers and stuff like that. So when we actually do come to, if we ever get to the point where we're writing a curriculum of slavery for secondary school students or whatever, we can't simply adopt, what's being used in the Western Hemisphere to write that history of slavery. And I mean, I really wonder, if let's say you publish the story of Bilal for a broader audience, does that diminish somehow the story that we want to tell about the way in which people were brought in huge numbers to the Arab Middle East for millennia to do agricultural labor and other kinds of things? I mean, do elite slaves like Bilal undermine that history, or do they enhance it somehow?
Well, most of the elite slaves are white. That's one thing. You know, Bilal was an unusual character, so perhaps he does upset the picture. It's important to remember that 2/3 to 3/4 of slaves brought to Egypt were female. And so you're not looking at agricultural labor per se as the dominant preoccupation of occupation of. You're looking at drudgery, drudge work. I mean, that's what they were involved in, and that's very difficult to portray. I guess there are ways to do that, but I mean, it's a little bit different to do that. But I understand your dilemma because Bilal is unusual. He's the exception, I suppose, that proves the rule, and that's why he attracted me, because he was given so much authority by the family, so much trust by the family.
Okay, well, I can just,
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. We really appreciate it. I know people are running to class. I just want to point out that on the 30th, is that right?
Yes, of November.
Yeah. Okay, so on the 30th of November, in 2 Tuesdays, we've got Samia Mahrez talking about depictions of AUC in Arabic literature and film. So I hope you can all join us for that. Thank you again, Terry.
Thank you.